quite a vague topic I've chosen for this evening, Roman warfare. And it's one of those things, it's a question where it's, I suppose, something of perspective. I did a book called Roman Warfare that came out back in 2000. I think I've signed at least one copy of it already this evening. And it was in a 24-volume history of warfare, series of volumes. Now, if you looked at that series and the way it was planned, there were, I think, 4 altogether on the Second World War. War in the Pacific, war in the West, both on land, naval warfare, and war in the air. I got to cover, in exactly the same space as just one of those things, 1,000 years of Roman military history. And it's this same challenge I'm trying to face this evening. So we are talking about an absolutely vast subject, and I will only be able to touch on a few aspects, but hopefully there is a great danger with any study of history that you lapse into the simple version, the easy stereotypes, the familiar story, and book after book, whatever the topic, will simply repeat those things. It will tell the reader what really he already knows. There's always a great danger in that we miss so much. So it's worth looking afresh at even topics we consider very familiar. So hopefully I'll just give an overview of Roman military history, but also suggest some slightly different ways of thinking about it this evening. The Roman Empire was, of course, hugely successful. It was very large in scale, bigger than any other pre-industrial empire. At its height, it stretched from the north of Britain to the Sahara Desert, from the Atlantic coast out to the Euphrates. That's a very big area. The Romans were, for instance, the only people, the only power ever to control all of the lands around the Mediterranean. No one's ever done that even in the rest of history. So the Roman Empire was big. It's even bigger when you consider that this is an era when the fastest that you can travel is as fast as a ship can sail on the sea or as fast as a horse can gallop on land. So that area becomes much bigger. And it's there for a very long time. It exists without any serious rival for over 500 years. It exists in a limited form, perhaps, down to the 15th century, when Constantinople finally falls to the Turks. So a topic like the Roman Empire, a topic like Roman warfare, is extremely large. But for all the grand success of the Romans, for all the great success of the Roman army that conquered and then maintained this empire, the other thing everyone knows about the Roman Empire is that it fell. Or because Gibbon's words are always there in our minds, it declined and fell. You can win for a long time. That seems to be the message of the Roman story, but you lose in the end. It's also had a profound influence on subsequent Western history. If you're studying the military history of anything really until the comparatively modern era, you go back, for instance, to the Civil War, and think how much of the curriculum at West Point then would have been based around the classics, of how people like Lee thought of Alexander and Caesar, as well as more recently of Frederick the Great and Napoleon, who themselves consciously said that they had learned a lot from the great captains of the past. So the idea of the Romans, we had the mention of Geoffrey Parker just a few moments ago, think of the military revolution in the early modern period, was shaped very heavily by this desire to recreate the success, the discipline, the prowess of the Roman legions, and to a great extent the armies of Alexander the Great. And you find in that period drill manuals written in the Hellenistic period were being translated and published, often with engravings on the cover that showed Alexander or Caesar dressed up as a 16th or 17th century soldier or commander. People actually tried to recreate the legions of Rome, and through that they hoped to recreate their success. But it is all too easy to think of the Romans and to imagine that it is rather a static affair, and forget that, as I've said at the beginning, we are dealing with an immensely long period of history. A lot changed. The pace of technological change was, of course, considerably slower than it has been in the last couple of centuries. But that is generally true of world history before that point. Even so, it is not static. Things do change, and the society and the economy that supported and produced that army changed profoundly over the centuries. So we're dealing with a big topic, and it isn't a simple one. We're also faced with the great problem of sources and evidence. With most modern periods, it is at least possible to get into the archives and find out what happened, though there are still mysteries, even for comparatively recent events. And pinning down just who was present at quite small battles, something like Rorke's Drift in 1879, actually saying who was there and who wasn't on the British side, where you're only numbering at most about 140 people, has proved impossible. There are several individuals who may or may not have been there, certainly lots more who claim to have been there. You go back to the Roman period and you have something like 0.001% of the sources that once existed have managed to survive to the modern world in any shape or form. We have lost many of the histories of the period. For instance, the Emperor Trajan. If you go to Rome, you can see Trajan's Column, which is this great tall monument with carved reliefs depicting the Emperor Trajan's invasion of Dacia and the 2 wars he fought there. That's modern-day Romania. Something like the Bayeux Tapestry. It obviously tells a story. There are all sorts of scenes there. The problem is we don't know what it meant. On the Bayeux Tapestry, you've got nice little captions, you know, Haraldus Rex Interfectus Est, King Harold is killed, all this sort of thing. With Trajan's Column, all you have is the pictures. We happen to know that the Emperor Trajan wrote, just like Julius Caesar, a detailed set of commentaries on his campaigns. And one line of those commentaries has survived, and it's survived in a grammatical text, and it illustrates the use of the accusative case. It basically talks about, and the Romans crossed a river. That's it. And from that, and these pictures, we're trying to reconstruct a complex set of campaigns. And that's quite a well-documented period. There are long eras of Roman history where we know extremely little, and there are other periods where the army is harder to see archaeologically. We'll come on to that in a moment. So there's a lot of guesswork and conjecture when we come to look at the Romans. We have to try and work out what makes sense. And we'll come back to this later because there is a big question mark over just how modern should we think of the Roman army at its height, when at its most professional, when, to all intents and purposes, it looks very modern. But are we sometimes imposing our own ideas of what an army should be on the evidence that we have for the Romans? But let's start off with something dramatic. Let's go back to one of the more famous incidents and one of the least successful incidents of Roman history. The Battle of Cannae was fought on the 2nd of August, 216 BC. And a Roman army of something like 86,000 men took on Hannibal's army of about 50,000 men and lost. And they didn't just lose, it was virtually annihilated. In a single day's fighting over a couple of square miles, the Romans lost something like 50,000 dead. They lost something like 15 to 20,000 prisoners and maybe had about 15,000 survivors. There are doubts, different sources present different, slightly different numbers they give in that. But that's basically what happened. One of the largest armies the Romans ever put into the field was virtually wiped out. Hannibal, to achieve this great victory, also suffered very heavy losses. He lost between 5,700, 8,000 men. That's about 11.5% to 16% of his entire force. Now, as far as we can tell, for the victorious army in most ancient battles rarely lost more than about 5% of its troops, and often lost considerably fewer than that. The vast majority of people in an ancient battle were normally killed when they turned their backs and they fled. They would be cut down then when they gave very little resistance. That Hannibal suffered that heavy loss gives one idea that backs up what our sources say, that those 50,000 odd Romans didn't die easily and quickly. Bear in mind as well, these sorts of figures, that is 50,000 dead, not 50,000 casualties, so therefore wounded and missing, 50,000 dead Roman soldiers. It's taking us to the scale of the losses in the First World War battles. But all of this was done by muscle-powered weapons. This was all done by hand, not by machine guns, not by artillery, not by things that killed at a distance. This was done in the main, again, not even by missile weapons, but by spears, by swords. So you are dealing with something that is quite alien to us in many ways, this scale of slaughter in such a small space. But it was an appalling defeat, and it was piled on earlier defeats that Hannibal had inflicted on the Romans in the last 2 years, since he'd crossed the Alps in 218 BC. In that time, he had probably killed or captured something like 25% of Rome's adult male population. 1 in 3 senators was dead. And all the ones remaining, apart from looking at all the spaces where other people used to sit, had lost family members. Now try to imagine that scale of devastation being inflicted on a modern state, and imagine the reaction. And the reaction of the Romans is distinctly odd. This should have been an appalling catastrophe, and it clearly was. And Hannibal assumed that through doing this he had won the war. After Cannae, he sent ambassadors to Rome to negotiate, first of all, for the ransoming of the prisoners he'd taken. It's a normal thing carried on throughout the Punic Wars up until this point. If you got captured and you had enough money, you could buy your freedom. It was a good way of raising funds for the victorious army. The Romans not only refused to meet his ambassador, but actually tell him that if he doesn't get off their territory within 24 hours, he will lose his diplomatic status and they'll kill him. They give a vote of thanks to the consul who survived this battle and the man who is generally held responsible for leading the army into this monumental disaster. Instead, the Senate comes out of the city to greet him, welcome him back home, and gives him a vote of thanks for not despairing of the Republic. Because what he had done, which was the perfect thing for a Roman commander, is he refused to talk to Hannibal. Most ancient wars ended in negotiation. It was rarely possible, particularly with a substantial state, to inflict such damage on the enemy that they could not fight on anymore. If you think of Alexander the Great, he had conquered the Persian Empire effectively in 3 battles. And at the end of that, the Persians said, right, fair enough, we've lost, you're now the king. It's fairly normal. Hannibal declared to the Roman prisoners he took that he was fighting not for a war of extinction, but he was fighting for power and for glory. He expected them to negotiate, to give him something, to give him money, to give him territory, to admit that Carthage was superior. This was how wars were decided in the ancient world. You have it in a more exaggerated scale, where in some of the conflicts between Greek city-states, they actually declared a fixed period of peace at the end of the war. So they would have 20 years peace or 30 years peace. And being canny politicians, as most of them were in those days, nearly always one side or the other would break that peace before it actually expired, and try to get the advantage on the enemy. But nevertheless, this concept that you could settle everything by negotiation, by sacrificing prestige, land, perhaps money. Yet the Romans refuse. They keep on fighting. They suffer other defeats, never quite as large scale as Cannae, but nevertheless they suffer them. They never manage to defeat Hannibal in a pitched battle in Italy, even though he stays there for over a decade more. But what they do is marshal the resources of the state, recruit more armies. The Roman army actually increases in size in terms of mobilized legions after Cannae compared to before, and they send those legions to Spain and eventually beat the Carthaginians there. They send them to Macedonia and take out Carthage's ally Macedon. They send them to Sicily and eventually overrun Sicily, and then they send them from Sicily to North Africa, and they go for the throat. They go for the jugular, and they attack Carthage itself. And that's what recalls Hannibal to Carthage, and he is there defeated at the Battle of Zama 14 years after Cannae in 202 BC. Now, this Roman army is essentially a temporary citizen militia, a conscript army. By the end of that period, it is just as efficient as any professional army in the world. In fact, it's better than most. It has learnt by its experience and those very bad experiences it had had. But the characteristic thing, the most striking thing, is the determination with which the Romans fought. They simply did not give in. If Hannibal had been invading any other state and had inflicted those sorts of losses on them, then they would have talked to him. They would have negotiated, they would have come to a settlement. Another difference would have been that if he'd arrived in any other state in the ancient world, he would surely have had in his entourage some exiled noblemen from that country. Persians, whenever they attacked Greece, they always had a few exiled Spartan kings and various other exiles from the different communities. There always were these people. The Romans didn't think that way. Roman politicians wanted to be successful at Rome itself or nowhere else. And the Romans took war very, very personally. A war against the Romans would end either with the complete destruction of the enemy as a political entity, which is what happened to Carthage in the end in 146, or the reduction of that enemy to be a clearly subordinate ally who would no longer be a threat. Either way, you were either extinct politically, or you were now Roman. You were now part of the Roman system, you were an ally of the Republic, you would provide soldiers and money to support the Republic in its future wars. The only alternative to that was that Rome itself would be destroyed. And no enemy the Romans faced had the power to do that. So let's look at this strange mixture of a militia, a conscript army that had grown really out of the same hoplite tradition that we see so clearly in classical Greece. The idea that an army should consist of your citizens and those citizens who have a greatest stake in the community. Therefore, the very wealthiest who were able to equip themselves with not only armor but also a horse would fight as cavalrymen. The better off, the middle classes, the well-to-do, would fight in the main part of the battle as hoplites or as Roman legionaries, as heavy infantrymen, because they could afford shield, body armor, helmet, sword, in the Romans' case, the javelin known as the pilum. So these armies consisted of not your poorest, not the people who couldn't find work anywhere else. So when you think back to those casualties at Cannae and elsewhere, this is ripping the heart out of the Roman state and Roman society. These are people whose absence will be very clearly noticed, but these are also people who, as the Romans see it, have an interest in the success of the state. So the wealthy don't send others to fight their wars for them at this stage in Roman history. And these citizens, when they go for military service, which they could be called upon for up to 16 years of their life, subjected themselves willingly to an extremely harsh system of discipline. This is an army where you can be beaten to death for falling asleep on sentry duty, for stealing from your comrades, for other crimes that seem comparatively minor. Now, other than Sparta, that of course has its rigorous military system, no one else did this. This is something completely different. They also have a willingness to make other people Roman citizens. The Romans were able to absorb the terrible losses Hannibal inflicted on them in a way that no other state could, because there were more of them than there were in any other state. In classical Athens, as the city became more democratic, it actually became much harder to become an Athenian citizen. You had to prove ancestry for several generations. The Romans, when they free one of their slaves, if the master is a Roman citizen, then the slave becomes a Roman citizen. He has slightly limited rights, but his son will be a citizen in every respect the same as anyone else. When you conquer your allies, particularly at first in Italy, you turn them into people with Latin status, or eventually into Roman citizens. The Greek historian Polybius estimated that Roman manpower of people with sufficient property to be eligible for military service, of the Romans and their allies just before the war with Hannibal, numbered 700,000. Now, the Athenians, if they mobilized everybody, could get about 30,000 on a really good day, and most of those wouldn't be terribly well equipped. The Spartans, in part because they have such a rather unpleasant form of upbringing and training that tends to produce a rather high mortality rate, really struggle with citizen manpower. And they gradually, over the years, their population diminishes of the true Spartiates, the true ones who'd gone through that training and that system. But the Romans willingly go and volunteer. Only on one or two occasions in centuries of Republican history do we ever hear of reluctance to serve in the army. And that's when things have been going particularly badly in Spain in the middle of the 2nd century BC. They're highly motivated. These are people who, again, are willing to give up running their farm or their business or whatever it might be and go off and serve the state for years on end and risk death and mutilation. They do not, however, appear in the archaeological record. This is a citizen army. These men, at the end of a campaign, go home. They don't set up monuments to themselves, as the later soldiers will do, as soldiers. You're allowed on festival days to wear any decorations you've won in military service. And you also will probably serve alongside your neighbors, your relations, your family. There is the strong motivating force that how you behave in the army will be known by all the people you live with, all the people you care about. And this is a great incentive, obviously, to do well. The men who gained a military reputation, particularly if they go into politics, tend to do very well out of this. But they are also respected more generally within the community. But this is an army that doesn't build peacetime bases. that doesn't commemorate itself as soldiers, that isn't in the main buried as soldiers. For all the great wars against Hannibal, against Carthage, against the Hellenistic kingdoms of the East, the wars in Spain and Gaul in the Republican period, these are almost invisible archaeologically, because the army that fights them is invisible. It is the citizen body of Rome at war, and you can see how Romans lived, but you very rarely get to see how they fight archaeologically. Starting to change a little bit. There's a team in Spain that seem to have found the site of the Battle of Baecula from the Second Punic War. And they're turning up some interesting stuff already, but it's very early days. Now, the one thing we know about this army was that you had to have sufficient property to be able to afford your own equipment. It does rather suggest that there was an element of you turned up with your full panoply, with your armor, and it's noted that many of the poorer citizens who couldn't afford a cuirass in mail would make do with a sort of pectoral plate, something that would be strapped on to protect heart and rib cage area, because they simply couldn't afford body armor, but they still would have the shield, the helmet, the sword, the pilum, all the things they needed to fight effectively. The one thing they lacked was the thing that might keep them a little bit safer. During the Second Punic War, we do hear of the state issuing equipment, and this has been confirmed by the battlefield site at Baecula. One of the things that's turned up in great numbers are hobnails from the boots of Roman soldiers. Now, in later years, of course, you famously have the Emperor Caligula, who's basically means it's little boots. He's named after the military boots, the caligae. We didn't think these were around as early as this, and yet they seem to be. So the state was organizing to the extent that it was equipping soldiers. Logically enough, you turn up for war and you end up getting sent to Spain for several years. The shoes or boots you arrive in are not going to last very long. And the state will be obliged to provide you with particularly clothing, but also replacement weapons. So there are aspects where this is becoming a more regular, a more permanent army, even at this early stage. But there is a limitation to this. The cycle of Roman public life was annual. Magistrates served in office for a year. You were consul for a year. You were then not supposed to be re-elected consul for 10 years, though they break that rule during the Second Punic War when they need experienced men. You might be given what they call proconsular authority to go off and hold command with the army for another year afterwards. But the army was essentially impermanent. All the famous Roman generals are praised for being good at training. When you call all these citizens up, yes, they're highly motivated. They feel that they are committed to the state, they want to serve the state, they're willing to subject themselves to this discipline. But there was no mechanism for calling people up in standard groupings. The odds were that each time you were called up, you would be serving with different people either side of you, under a different commander, under different centurions. Every single year, the legions of the Roman people were renumbered. This was a prestige thing so that the two consuls could command legions 1 to 4. This continues right the way through into the 1st century BC. At the end of every conflict, those legions were demobilized. You'd go back into the citizen community. You might get called up again. So you might, if you're lucky as a Roman commander, have a corps of experienced veterans in your new recruits. But again, they're not experienced fighting alongside each other under those officers. It took time to turn a Roman army like this into a very effective fighting force. And the early battles of the Second Punic War are marked by great clumsiness in the Roman tactical behavior. These armies are not subtle. They simply can't do anything very clever because they haven't had time to train. Cannae is marked by extremely simplistic tactics. A sledgehammer blow that Hannibal is clever enough to deflect and then rob of its momentum and then destroy. Now, it's one of those terrible cases of really bad timing that the Kingdom of Macedonia and then the Seleucid Kingdom of Syria and Asia Minor, the two of the great successor states of Alexander the Great's conquest in the 4th century BC, they pick the years just after the Second Punic War to fight the Romans. Now, these Hellenistic kingdoms have professional armies, very similar in style to those of Alexander the Great, lots of pikemen, not as many cavalry as Alexander had. Alexander's campaigns were very successful, but they wrecked the horse stocks and studs of Macedonia irreparably. These armies are professional. These are soldiers who serve for a long time. Fighting is all that they do. However, they don't necessarily do it very often, because a good professional army hopefully frightens all your neighbors so you don't have to fight them, and you can just intimidate them into giving you what you want. These people pick a fight with the amateur civilian Romans at a time when Roman legions regularly consist of men who've been in the army for 10 years or more, who've grown up in the hard school of fighting against Hannibal. That's also true of their officers and their leaders. The man who wins the Battle of Cynocephalae in 197 BC and ends the Second Macedonian War was consul at the age of 30, more than 12 years before you should have been, but was someone who'd been a teenager when Hannibal arrived and had spent most of his young adulthood fighting, and fighting against very tough opponents. That generation really knew what they were doing. But there is no mechanism within the Roman system for preserving that experience. And the course of the 2nd century BC sees a gradual erosion of the ability of Roman commanders, the experience of the troops, and the experience of the officers who command them. So by the middle of the 2nd century, the Roman army suffers a series of disasters, much smaller in scale than Cannae, but humiliating nonetheless. You even get the shameful case in Numantia in northern Spain, where a Roman army gets bottled up in a ravine, and the Celtiberians, the tribesmen there, have surrounded them on either side. The Roman consul then, a chap called Mancinus, negotiates with the enemy to save his army. He does what they hadn't done after Cannae. He agrees to go back to Rome and say, we'll give peace to these tribes, we'll let them alone. And his army escapes. Now, the Roman Senate, being typically Roman and politicians to a man, decide when he gets back to Rome, well, actually, the army is safe now, so we don't need to ratify this treaty. And what we'll do, because Mancinus gave his words to the Spanish, we will chain him up, strip him of clothes, and dump him naked outside the town of Numantia and say, right, sorry, we're not having this treaty, so take it out on him. The Spanish, to their credit, look over the walls, think, well, what the hell do you expect us to do with that? And just leave him there. And eventually Mancinus is taken away by his attendants. In the manner of Roman politicians, he then commissions a statue of himself, naked and in chains, to put in his porch to show everybody how he was willing to die for the Republic and stuff, all this sort of thing. But you have an army that can become extremely good. That's average is okay, that is highly motivated, but is rather a fragile, rather temporary thing. It has to keep on starting afresh, relearning all the lessons of the past. It's not very good at technical things like sieges. Doesn't have that knowledge as yet. Now, its leaders are aristocratic. They are politicians. They are people who will have a career that gives them civil posts and military posts. They are also desperately eager for military glory in the 12 months of office that they serve as consul. So they tend to be very aggressive. Their experience and ability varied, but these are people who are raised from the cradle to lead others, to manipulate a crowd, to deliver a speech, whether it's in the forum or an army camp, to know how to motivate people to vote for them, to follow them. They also learn by watching. There is never, at any time in Roman history, any formal training for officers, for commanders. At no point. There are no military academies at any stage in Roman history. How you learn is by watching others do it. You follow your father or your uncle or some family member. You are attached to his staff as a teenager. You watch what he does. You see how it happens. You start taking on Julius staff functions. You gain increasingly senior posts as your career goes along. In theory and often in practice, this could actually give you quite a lot of experience, because bear in mind, you didn't have peacetime military experience. When the Romans have a legion, it tends to go somewhere to fight someone. So military service is fairly intensive. Now, the Roman army produces its fair share of buffoons who make a complete mess of it, and in some cases this leads to disaster. There is, however, an old idea that their entire tactical system was designed to take control away from the commander. And this is repeated down to this day. It is, unfortunately, complete nonsense. You've only got to think about the basic deployment of the Roman legion in battle, the triplex acies, the 3 lines. Now, in the Republic, this was based around the age of the soldiers involved. You had the younger men in the front because they were thought to be more aggressive. The seasoned soldiers formed the second line, and the veterans were at the back, in the place where any sensible man would want to be. There was no mechanism for committing those troops. When you think of it, that means 2/3 of your army begins the battle in reserve. Alexander never did that. No Greek general would ever do that. Most of Alexander's battles, there is no reserve whatsoever, because Alexander the Great is steaming off at the head of his companions and plunging into the middle of the Persian army or the Indians, whoever it might be. He is not in any position to start sending out messengers or to have any real awareness once the battle has begun. He sets it up to the point where he will pounce and then go straight at them. The Roman system from the beginning is different. It places considerable decision-making power in the hands of the general, and that will remain true throughout Roman history. So the system itself does not suggest amateur, incompetent commanders at all. It suggests people are actually, on average, pretty good. Because otherwise you'd end up fighting battles and half your troops would not get committed in the right place at the right time. Anyway, let's move on to the professional army, the Roman army that's more famous. Their earlier successes in the Republic mean they acquire provinces. Acquiring provinces sometimes means that if you've got frontier zones, as in Spain, as in Cisalpine Gaul, you will need garrisons. And if you need garrisons, that means some people who want to really be back on their farm are getting stuck in Spain for 5 years or 10 years and might come back and find that the place has been ruined in the meantime. The farmer soldiers struggle to cope, and there's a gradual shift to recruiting the people who want to serve rather than the ones who are obliged to serve. That old willingness of your farmer soldier to go off and submit to military service is worn thin when that can mean your effective ruination. If you are sent away for a decade or more and you don't know whether you're going to come back, what is going to happen to your family, what is going to happen to your farm? People begin to think that this is no longer something that is a duty that is fair. On the other hand, as the population continues to grow, there are many people who don't have farms, who don't have property, or are the younger sons, or are the men who have a farm, a small plot of land that cannot support their family. And these people are very keen to serve because the prospect of military service, A, means that they'll gain status within the community because they will come back, and if they're lucky, they might have got promoted, they might have got decorated. There's the opportunity for plunder, for loot. With successful wars, particularly successful wars in the East, which were thought of as easy victories against very wealthy opponents, then going off to war is a very attractive proposition. A whole class of professional, semi-professional officers grow up, and by the end of the 2nd century, there are more and more of Rome's poorer citizens who in the past have been excluded from military service, who are in fact the only people willing to volunteer and think, yeah, I can afford to go for 5 years or 10 years. This will eventually turn, by a fairly complicated and not fully understood process, into the army that is really rationalized by the Emperor Augustus at the very end of the 1st century BC. This is the Roman army that's the famous one. This is the army where you will join and serve for 25 years, where at the end of that 25 years you'll be given either a bounty in money or a plot of land on which to settle. So this is the army that is the professional, disciplined Roman army where, again, this is the only thing these people do, is to be soldiers. It's more recognizably the Roman army we know, but the transition is quite interesting. It does look in the 1st century BC as if people are serving for varied terms of enlistment. And we hear in the build-up to the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey of men's demobilization date becoming appearing at various times, and this is thought of as something that will weaken each side. We don't really know how things are working. The most frequently repeated suggestion is that the minimum enlistment was probably for 6 years at this time. We don't know. Another thing that the soldiers in this era have, which they'll not be allowed to do later, is that they have families and wives. It is probable that it is Augustus who abolishes the right of Roman soldiers to marry. And if you are married when you enlist with the army by the 1st century AD, you are given an immediate divorce. This is one of those things where it is very clearly the case that the state does not want to pay for widows, does not want to pay for families. Doesn't seem to have anything to do particularly with military discipline. What it means is the state is just saying, you can do what you like, but we're not paying for them. Because it is abundantly clear that very many Roman soldiers do have people they consider to be wives, do raise families, and that very frequently any sons end up enlisting in the Roman army and tend to do quite well because they've grown up in that environment. You find in the 1st century a lot of men who list their place of origin as incastries, born in the camp. And this is, it's a significant part of the Roman army. So, although the state says you can't marry, very clearly they turned a blind eye and let this happen. They actually admit, because auxiliary soldiers, the non-citizens, the foreigners who serve in the Roman army and also serve for 25 years, at the end of that time get granted Roman citizenship, not only for themselves, but for their wife and children. So the state there is quite openly admitting, well, we know we've actually said you can't marry, but we know you've been doing it anyway. If you're increasingly in Roman forts, archaeologists are realizing that lots of objects associated with women and children turn up inside the barrack areas. It's most noted at Vindolanda, just south of Hadrian's Wall, where you have children's and women's shoes, for instance. The leather there is very well preserved. And the probability is, it's been one of those misfortunes that the archaeologists studying the Roman army have tended to think in a very modern way. And they've forgotten that the right to privacy is quite a recent thing. And that you could go back to 19th century British Army barrack blocks, and the married quarters would be a rope with blankets over it at one end of a room. At that period, normally you'd have 3 soldiers sharing a cot. You know, the idea, we tend to think of it as natural to have our own room, have our own bed. All of these things are unusual. So it shouldn't have surprised us that there are all these women and children inside Roman barrack blocks, and that these places were probably crowded, very bustling affairs. But this is the army that we know. This is the army that we see so often in imagery. It's even the army that we get a sort of slightly garbled Hollywood look from. That's pretty much, whether it's Gladiator or The Eagle or whatever, any of these movies, the soldiers look like something that's almost like the images on Trajan's Column. They never quite get it right because, after all, this is Hollywood, and if they got it right, they'd really be upset at the end of that. But this is the army that is extremely visible archaeologically. This is the army of fortresses, of forts, of big stone permanent bases throughout the empire. They are, curiously enough, different shapes in the east. In the east, forts tend to be square. In Britain, in northern Europe, in the area that I'm sort of more familiar with, they're a playing card shape. They're more rectangular with rounded corners. For some reason, we don't really understand. They don't do that when they move to Asia Minor and beyond. They seem to stick with square forts because that's what everyone else in the past had built in those areas, and it's just clearly what everyone thought that's what a fort should be. Now, this is the army that develops the frontier systems along the Rhine, along the Danube. Most famously, Hadrian's Wall in Britain, built 80 Roman miles long, with turrets every third of a mile, with what we call mile castles, we don't know what the Romans called them, every mile, with then forts with auxiliary cohorts that are roughly battalion size or small battalion size built on them. It's a very complicated, very expensive structure, and one that actually we don't really understand as well as we'd like. Because although it's exercised the attentions of archaeologists for well over 150 years and continues to do so, it's only mentioned half a dozen times in any Greek or Latin piece of literature, and they don't really tell us very much about what it's for or how it worked. The Greek orator Aelius Aristides in the 2nd century could talk about the Roman army encamped like a rampart, enclosing the civilized world in a ring. This is the army where the historian Josephus, the fellow who had fought as a rebel in the Jewish rebellion in AD 66 against the Roman army. He's one of the very few people who gives us an account of what it was like to face the legions. But then, of course, being rather a cunning individual, manages to change sides and gets to be a favorite of Vespasian, who wins the civil war that follows and becomes emperor, so writes us a history really very much more from the Roman point of view than the rebel point of view. But he described the Roman army in this almost perfect form, as this incredible, rigidly disciplined force. The famous quote is that the Roman army had drills that were like bloodless battles and battles that were bloody drills. And then he goes on to say that the Roman soldiers were never confused by surprise, by misfortune, by a whole list of things. And it's a wonderful, idealized passage of the Roman army, until you go and read his main text, where he actually describes lots of occasions where Roman soldiers did run away when they were surprised, when they were confused, when things went wrong. We've sometimes in the modern era tended to accept this image of iron-disciplined Roman army as this monumental thing that somehow never wavered, was always perfect. It's clearly not the case. You've only got to look, even quite briefly, at the sources, whether it's Julius Caesar's account, whether it's all the other histories. Like any army, at any time in history, the Roman army wasn't perfect. So much depends, as it does at any time, on the conditions, in particular the individuals. Personalities of a commander does have such a profound influence on a unit, how it performs. It did in the 1st century AD, it does today. You can look today at people who've come through exactly the same system of military training, at whatever level, and some will perform exceptionally well and others will fail. And it is very hard to tell until you get to that point why these things happen. These are human beings. These are not machines. That was always this tendency. The Roman army is this great machine that was so rigidly disciplined that you simply pointed it in one direction, it went and chewed through anything that was in its path. So much of this is myth, and yet so much of the army in this era does seem very, very modern. It has a command structure, a hierarchy of ranks. It has routine. It has bases. It has training areas. It has drills. It has something that will be familiar to anyone who's ever worn a uniform at any time, vast amounts of paperwork and bureaucracy following you around for every stage of your life. Whether you're a recruit joining the army or even a horse or a mule, your entire time in the army will be followed and recorded in triplicate or even more. It might not be on paper, it might be on papyrus, it might be on wooden writing tablet, it might even be on pieces of broken pottery. They're used quite often for almost as note paper in North Africa, for instance, and sometimes in Egypt, because papyrus was expensive. The sheer quantity of this, we have a tiny, tiny fraction of what once existed. But this was all regulated. We also read of centurions who might serve in 7 or 8 different legions at opposite end of the empires during their career. Now, all of this was clearly centrally recorded. You can't just have commanders giving out commissions as centurions to anyone they like. There was a limited number. The emperor had control of this. He could find out what was going on. How this bureaucracy worked, we don't really understand. But clearly at Rome and elsewhere, all of this was recorded. Like any bureaucracy, it's scarcely perfect. Lots of things would go wrong. Lots of people would get lost in the system. But nevertheless, it's there. You've got systems where the pay of recruits is recorded. And the deductions from their pay, all of these things that, again, very familiar. You could look at a duty roster of a Roman century from a legion in Egypt in the 1st century, and it wouldn't be that different to something that you'd see posted up in a barrack block today. On the other hand, this is not a modern society. So a lot of things are rather different. One obvious contrast is perhaps more of a technological thing. The Romans concentrate overwhelmingly on the teeth arms of the service. You don't get really Roman logistic specialists. In fact, what the army has in this period are state-owned slaves who undergo, even though they've been bought, a basic military training, and they're in charge of the mules, the baggage wagons, the supply element. And they wear helmets. They wear a basic form of uniform. And these appear even in Julius Caesar's day, and they're probably earlier than that. But nevertheless, even though there's this emphasis on everyone being a soldier, there are still large numbers of specialists. There are administrators. There are considerable number of men who are defined by the job they do. They are the immunes, the men immune from fatigues because they had a specialist skill. They are the beneficiarii later on, who often serve out detached from their units. There do seem to be standardized drills, although there is also some evidence that suggests that in different areas of the empire these drills are adapted. That legions, say in Cappadocia, facing nomadic tribes that rely largely on cavalry, might have operated differently to, say, a legion stationed in Britain that faces a different military problem. But the thing is recognizably the same. The structure is there. There is just a natural and sensible ability to adapt to local situations. And there is also a tendency, periodically emperors come along and they impose new regulations and they try and standardize things again. Roman army equipment, Roman army bases are not quite identical. This is a pre-industrial society. So you don't have, in the same way that today, your belt, your water bottle, so many bits of equipment will be exactly the same for everybody in service. In the Roman army, they're almost the same. They're recognizably doing the same thing, the same design, but there are lots of little differences. This is a world where everything is still produced by craftsmen, not by mass production, where Roman army bases look very, very familiar, whether they're in Britain or whether they're in Egypt, in terms of their internal layout. But they're never absolutely identical. And probably some of the reasons why they were built that way and were slightly different were forgotten over the period of occupation, because some of these are in occupation for centuries on end. The mile castles I mentioned on Hadrian's Wall, 3 legions were involved in the building of Hadrian's Wall. They were obviously, one assumes, given the same template, this is what we want you to make. the design of Mile Castle is slightly different in each case. Dimensions are just slightly different. And clearly, someone who was given the task in that unit interpreted things in a different way, and then the unit went and did it all that way. But you move along to the next section of the wall, and they perform the same function perfectly well. They're just slightly different. But again, a lot of these peculiarities you would see today. Now, there is another great myth of the Roman army that refers to the officers, the centurions. And time and again, these still get referred to as sergeant majors, as warrant officers, senior NCOs, as men primarily promoted from the ranks after long service as an ordinary soldier. I don't know why this keeps on getting repeated, because there really isn't any evidence for it at all. We do have evidence for a small number of men who managed to make that leap from being an ordinary soldier to be a centurion. However, we also hear of people from the equestrian order, the social class next down from the Senate, who went in at the army commissioned directly as centurions. And the probability is that most Roman centurions were, in effect, professional officers. They went in either at that rank or in a more junior command level. But most did not go through long service in the ranks. That is just one of those myths. Some of these men do actually serve for quite short times. It's almost a sort of aristocratic thing. You go and do a few years in the army and you go back and run the estate in some small Italian town. What centurions needed to be was highly literate. You can send a centurion as ambassador to the Parthian Empire. Gives you some idea of the sort of level these people are considered to be socially in a system that is very conscious of social class, of level of education. But there are problems. We don't really understand the command structure of centurions and how it worked. We know that centurions differed in rank, and it is a great mistake to see centurion itself as a rank. It is a grade of officer. And some of them had a responsibility equivalent to a company commander. Others very probably were effectively battalion commanders. But we don't know if this was based around the post you held and the title you had, which we do know something about, or it was due to individual seniority. So the most senior, the longest served centurion would always command the cohort. That's something fairly fundamental, how these cohorts worked in battle, how the basic tactical unit of a legion worked, and we don't have the evidence to understand it properly. It's one of the many frustrating things about understanding the Roman army. Within that, again, we've got our amateur senatorial officers. We've also got a command system that's based around patronage as much as it is trying to recognize merit or talent. There is no sense of a fair turn or waiting for seniority and becoming eligible after so many years, as far as we can tell. It's all about patronage. The most common form of literature to survive from the ancient world is a letter of recommendation. And we get them in Tacitus, or at least we get them in Pliny, we get them from that era, we get them in Cicero, it's most of what he wrote. We get them in the Vindelander tablets, these wooden writing tablets from this fort just south of Hadrian's Wall. Now, let's look quickly, oh dear, very quickly, because my time has been rushing away, at the army at war. Again, it's not this monolithic machine-like thing. Several things stand out about how the Romans fought. One is aggression. The Roman army was comparatively small in terms of its numbers, but in the professional era, it is of high quality, at least even on average. The average is pretty good. It's not always perfect. It's not always as good as it should be, because that'll depend on how well the training program has been implemented, what preparation you've had for this conflict. But it is generally speaking good. It is generally speaking better than the opposition, and it is always aggressive. It seeks from the beginning to seize the initiative and then hold it and to grind the enemy into the dust. The same mentality of refusing to admit defeat and keeping on going at the enemy until he does or until he is destroyed persists throughout this period. It's the same mindset that beat Hannibal. There's also, it's not a defensive army. There is a great emphasis on attacking or counter-attacking. The automatic Roman response to rebellion is to gather whatever troops are immediately available and march straight at the perceived heart of that rebellion and knock some heads together. They do this, for instance, in 4 BC and AD 6 in Judea. Mass crucifixions, burn down a few towns, enslave some people, terrify a rebellion before it gets going. They try exactly the same thing in AD 66 when the rebels are more organized, and it leads to a disaster and the loss of more than 5,000 men and the loss of a legionary eagle outside Jerusalem. When they get as far as Jerusalem, suddenly realize the rebels are actually organized and fighting, and this army has not got the supplies and is not sufficiently organized and trained to mount a full siege of Jerusalem. Retreating obviously only encourages the rebels, and they get chased through the Bet Horon Pass, suffer very badly. Sometimes it fails, but 9 times out of 10, probably 99 times out of 100, that display of force, that display of overwhelming confidence actually works. It's something Julius Caesar did repeatedly, but lots of other commanders do. Julius Caesar is sometimes depicted by comparison with more recent generals as very rash. But that's actually a mistake. If you look in detail at the commentaries that he wrote, he always emphasizes that he made every possible preparation. Only at that point, when there was nothing more to be gained by waiting, then he would go bald-headed straight at the enemy and take risks. And he did take a lot of risks. But he didn't take unnecessary risks. And that is the Roman ideal. It is aggression tempered by a little bit of common sense. Make sure you've done everything you can, but once you've done that, there is no point in holding back. The Emperor Augustus had as one of his favorite sayings, hurry slowly, festine lente. Better a safe commander than a bold. But it was really only to sort of temper that aristocratic instinct towards aggression. Now, they're very aggressive, they're also very determined. The enemy is not an equal, particularly once they've come to dominate the Mediterranean, once they've beaten people like Carthage. There isn't actually anyone who could be considered to be an equal to the Roman Empire out there. But from as far as the Romans were concerned, there never had been. The Romans have no concept of international law, of rights of others. It's rather like you have the quote in Virgil where the duty or the mission of the Romans is proclaimed as parcere subjectis et debellare superbos, to spare the conquered and overcome the proud in war. Basically, you divide the world into people you've already beaten and who are suitably humble, and people who are looking a bit too cocky by half, so really deserve to be beaten up. Julius Caesar talks about pacifying areas in northwest Gaul that have never had any contact with the Romans before, but just looked at his envoys in a slightly dodgy way. They even had a verb for it, pacare, to pacify. So they're very determined. The enemy will be beaten. The enemy will give in. Just as earlier on, a rebellion inside the empire will always be defeated. That's the problem that the Jewish rebels face when they rebel against Nero, when they rebel against Hadrian. In the end, they can't win. They haven't got the resources to take on an empire, and the Romans will not give up a province that is surrounded by other provinces. They give up Germany in AD 9 after the loss of 3 legions there in an ambush, but even then they don't admit that they've given it up for well over 100 years or so, and they keep talking about this is an ongoing war. We'll go back there someday. There isn't this acceptance. It's a mistake to talk of the Romans dreaming of empire without limits, but they do talk of imperium sine fine, power without limits. It's one thing we easily forget. Our word empire comes from the Roman imperium, but it does not mean territorial empire, it means power. And although the Romans acquire a territorial empire, what they were always interested in was power. The fact that there was no one who could stop them from doing what they wanted. And sometimes that didn't mean going and occupying territory. If you look at things like Hadrian's Wall, on the one hand, you see all the reconstructions, it looks like a long castle wall going along the hilltops, cutting northern Britain. It's a barrier to the enemy. But in every mile castle, and you've built 80 of the things, there's a gateway. Now, whoever designed this, whether it was the Emperor Hadrian or someone else, had an extremely bureaucratic mind, because some of these gateways, if you go to Hadrian's Wall, actually open out onto a cliff. You walk about 3 paces and then you're going down very fast. Others on slopes that you couldn't possibly get a wagon down. But they built them. That's what the army said it was going to do, and that's what it did. Later on, they sometimes realized this is actually pointless, so they brick them up, but they've been there. The key point with this is in part the bureaucratic mentality, but also this was not designed as a barrier to the Roman army. It is built as somewhere from which you can advance. It didn't limit your power. It stops the enemy from coming south, but you have outpost forts from the very beginning. Beyond that, you have centurions and others sitting in on the meetings of tribal elders, finding out what's going on. You also, just as, well, you could say people were doing in the 19th century in Afghanistan and we're doing now, you're using money and diplomacy to control the population, or trying to keep an eye on what's happening. If ever there's a big problem there and they raise an army and they start to attack you, your Roman troops will move out through all those gateways in that wall, go north, and beat the living daylights out of anyone they're fighting in open battle, because that's what you're good at. You don't wait behind that wall to be attacked. It is not a barrier to you. So again, it's this determination. The other thing that I think the old ideas of machine-like Roman army completely obscured and really hide one of the greatest reasons for the Roman army's success was that it was extremely flexible. The Romans learned from mistakes. They do make quite a lot of mistakes, like anyone else. Bear in mind, this is an army that is asked to deal with enemies that are radically different, with geographical conditions, with climate conditions that are radically different. This is an army that has to operate in the Sahara Desert or in the Atlas Mountains just in North Africa. Very, very different areas, against completely different peoples, against peoples who in the main have very little political unity. So you have to understand how these different tribes work, all the different languages they speak. What will intimidate one particular tribe? Which hostages you should take from the Germans as opposed to the Britons to make them keep the peace? Which people you should bribe? How you should fight? They also boast of their copying from enemies. They boasted that they took tactics, they took equipment from the Samnites, from the Gauls, from the Greeks. They were proud of this. Famously in the First Punic War, when the Romans come up against the naval power of Carthage and they don't have a fleet of their own, a Carthaginian warship runs aground on an Italian beach. The Romans take it to pieces, something that we now know archaeologically was perfectly practical to do because that's how those ships were constructed. They were built to a template. They take it to pieces and build 100 copies of their own. The basic technology in this case is far less complicated than, say, building a 18th or 19th century sailing ship. And it's something that carpenters, that smiths can do. And probably the first 10 or 12 or 20 ships were pretty ropey. But by the time you're getting to number 100, and by the time they've built successive hundreds as the war goes on, yours are every bit as good as the ones the Carthaginians have been making, and you learn how to use them. Again, they come up with these ideas, but it's that determination, that willingness to throw resources at a problem, as well as the effort. And they also boast of they take these things and then they make them better, or they make more of them. The sword they have, the gladius sword, which perhaps until the modern era, perhaps until the AK-47, probably responsible for killing more human beings than any other weapon in history. They copy from the Spanish. But whereas the Spanish would, if they're lucky, have some of these swords for the wealthiest warriors, for the chieftains, for the leaders, for the Romans, it's the side armor of every legionary, of every auxiliary soldier, who also has a mail shirt and a helmet like only the wealthiest of the Gauls, and who has the training, who has the opportunity to prepare for war full time. Lots of cultures can produce a small number of extremely good warriors, like a medieval knight, like a samurai. But it's when you get to, in a sense, the industrialization of warfare that you produce lots and lots of soldiers who might not be quite as good as these people for whom it is such a cultural thing, but you will have 100 of yours to every one of theirs, if not more. And yours will be used to working as a team and not as individuals. And yours are going to win in almost every situation other than perhaps individual fights. But let's just finish with a nice example of flexibility that comes from a campaign in Numidia in the 20s AD. And it just shows how the Romans would adapt to these things. They're facing a rebel called Tacfarinas, a former auxiliary in the Roman army who's deserted and is now raiding the Roman provinces. It's one thing, it's an aspect of Roman snobbery. They always like to believe that their most dangerous enemies were people they trained themselves. So Arminius the German is the man who wiped out 3 legions. He'd served in the Roman army. There is even a tradition that Spartacus had been a Roman auxiliary before he became a slave, before he became a gladiator. You know, it's this idea, yeah, they're quite good, but they're only good because they learn from us. Now, Tacfarinas is very effective as a raider. He's got lots of these light cavalry, these Numidian light horsemen, but he gets a bit carried away by his numbers, by his success, raises a big army, is willing to risk meeting the Romans in battle. The Romans have only got a single legion and auxiliaries. They've got a fairly inexperienced commander. Nevertheless, the battle is one-sided. The Numidians are massacred, suffer very heavy losses, and are chased away. So the Romans try simple response, the same thing you could do fighting a Greek army or a Carthaginian army, pitch battle, and it works. But Tacfarinas gets away with quite a lot of his men and doesn't go away. He keeps on raiding, and after that lesson, he's definitely not going to fight the Romans in battle again. So the Romans adapt. First of all, they try to defend. Then they quickly realize that they can't break up the army enough to protect every little farm, every little village, every community from raiding. The enemy can move far quicker than you. So then they try, okay, well, we'll defend some areas. We'll fortify some areas, and we'll try and bring people in. We'll try and make those safe. And then we'll go out with big columns, and we'll chase them down. The problem is the big columns, again, are too big, too clumsy, too slow-moving. This is the Numidians' country. They know how to live there. They know how to fight there. They know how to move there. They don't want to get caught. So then they break down into lots of smaller columns. And then they create a system of, almost like blockhouses in the South African War at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. You divide the area up. So you can start to have little columns that operate from these, chasing them, hopefully trying to trap them, or at least catch them from areas, and you get more information as to what's going on. You also do something that has been a great path to success in so many eras. You go and find some local people who don't like Tacfarinas and his men and hire them to be your scouts, to be your patrol leaders, to show you how to live and how to operate in the desert. Just the same as, you know, when you think of Geronimo being chased down by Apache scouts, because they're the people who can do this. And there's always, in most of these societies, there's usually significant groups who don't like everybody else. You know, you're not dealing with a united population, so it's nearly always easy to find somebody. Or who will simply see service with the Roman army as a good way to prove themselves as warriors to get rewards. So that works. That starts to make life difficult for Tacfarinas. They then do something which again has rather echoes of the wars out on the plains in the 19th century, is that they wait for winter when Tacfarinas has to camp somewhere, find out where that is, probably again through the local scouts, send a column, and they go and attack the camp, but with specific orders to kill him. Don't worry about the others, get the leader. Charismatic leader's the man causing the trouble. If he goes, we know this will drop to smaller scale. They've done it elsewhere. Julius Caesar has given similar orders to his men. The end of the Dacian War, of the Emperor Trajan that's there on Trajan's column, is bringing the head of the king Decebalus to Trajan. And by a rather interesting fluke, we've actually found the tombstone of the young cavalry officer who actually performed that. And he shows himself sort of mirror image of the scene on Trajan's column. He shows himself trying to stop. The Dacian king actually committed suicide before they got to him, but nevertheless they got him. The point is, the leader's gone, and therefore things seem to diminish until another charismatic leader comes. So you can see this willingness to adapt, to change. They learn from mistakes. They learn if something doesn't work, they don't keep doing it. They change. And they do this time and again, and sometimes it is a slow, sometimes it is a painful process. But it is as much as the aggression and the determination and the professionalism and the skill. These things contribute. This is one of the reasons why the Romans are so successful, and it's one of the biggest reasons. Because they learn and because they adapt. And the combination of all these things make them extremely formidable. One thing I ought to do before, I mean, there's all sorts of things we could talk about grand strategy and all those questions, but one thing I don't want to be seen as making a mistake that we all almost inevitably fall into when you study military history. Whatever the period, it is inevitably easier to study it from one side. That is something it is very hard not to do in the Roman era because all the sources are going to be written down by the Romans. You're lucky that you have someone like Josephus who can actually tell you what it was like to fight the Roman army. And his accounts of this are fascinating. Otherwise, the only people we hear of fighting the Romans are other Romans who were fighting them in civil wars, which is interesting in its way but tends to follow different rules. But we shouldn't forget the other side of the hill. The Roman Empire doesn't exist in a vacuum. Roman wars aren't fought in a vacuum. Now, there is a big mistake. It's particularly fashionable these days when, obviously, empires are not considered such a good thing as they used to be. 100 years ago, then nearly everybody writing about it thought, yes, you know, empires, they bring enlightenment, they bring progress, they bring Christianity, prosperity, and, you know, all of these things. Nowadays, it's, especially in places like Britain, where we don't have an empire anymore, so it's been fashionable for the last 50 years to pretend we didn't really want one in the first place. It was just some accident that happened, and that we're really nice people and we don't go conquering anybody because we can't anymore. There's this automatic response, especially amongst a lot of academics, that empires are bad. And more dangerous is that then that can lead on to the idea, well, if they're bad, they're probably inefficient as well. Or that they are solely the aggressors. One theme that runs right throughout Roman history is the willingness with which ancient communities went to war. The Romans are not different because they fight lots of wars. They are different because of how they go about it and the determination and the degree to which they push a war to a final resolution. They don't want to fight the same people again next year if they can possibly help it. They don't mind fighting somebody else next year, but they want a decision. There's one nice quote, which I've got here and we'll just use, that comes from 189 BC. And it's Roman army is marching through Asia Minor, reaches this place called Tabai. And it hasn't been involved in a campaign against the Seleucids that's gone on a year or so before, hasn't come into contact with the Romans at all. But the Roman army is marching along. The locals see the advance elements of the Roman army that don't look too numerous, so they attack them. However, they then realize, this is Livy's account, soon it became apparent that they were no match for the Romans, either in numbers or in soldierly qualities, and they were driven back into the town. Then they begged forgiveness for their mistaken behavior and were ready to surrender their city. And the consul demanded of them a sum of silver and a great quantity of wheat to supply his army, and their surrender was accepted on those terms. So you have a people coming to apologize for the Romans, saying, "Oh, sorry, we thought you were weak, so we attacked you. And we realize our mistake, so we won't do it again." Raiding is something that is prevalent throughout the ancient world. It is clearly there in the Iron Age and much earlier. And it's something the Romans encounter on frontier after frontier. Sometimes in internal areas it expresses itself more as banditry. If someone looks vulnerable and has something worth stealing, then you'll probably do it. And there's some stuff that sadly is not yet published, ostraca that's come up from Egypt, from the routes down to the Red Sea ports, that has an account written by a Roman cavalry officer of a raid on a caravan of people that had taken shelter outside a tiny Roman outpost that's probably manned by a dozen or so soldiers. And you read this account and it's straight out of a John Ford Western. You know, these people have been attacked. The attackers have made off with some children. The Romans chase after them and they find the bodies of the children as they go along and they never catch the attackers. You are dealing with a world where there is a lot of low-level violence. This is within the Roman Empire, technically. On frontier areas, that's much more common. There is a danger that modern academics tend to isolate that. They think of, well, that's smaller scale, it's not about big wars. The Roman attitude is different. The Roman attitude is that if you don't stop this, then if 10 people came to raid you and they get away with it this year, then next year you'll probably get 100. Year after that, you'll get 1,000. So they deal with these problems, or try to, at a low level. There isn't a big division between high-intensity and low-intensity warfare. They are ends of the same scale that can flow from one into the other quite easily and frequently do. So the army has to operate at both those levels, both politically and diplomatically. And perhaps one final point, because I really ought to finish. I've talked all the time about Roman warfare. I've only mentioned diplomacy a couple of times. But something fundamental about the Roman system is this. The Roman generals are men who are following political careers in public life. They, when they go to govern a province, are the supreme military and civilian authority in the same place. Compare that to the division of responsibilities of institutions of different government departments in the modern era. You went to Roman Britain, or Julius Caesar in Gaul, that man, the governor, has supreme authority in every respect, which means that he knows very clearly the political reasons for what he's doing. So that's one thing. Military and civilian and political decision-making is not ever divided at Rome. It is done by the same people. And that gives a purpose to Roman warfare that many armies have lacked. But within that, it also means that from the beginning, they don't want to fight unless they have to. They are perfectly willing to get the enemy to submit simply to a show of force. They are also, Roman wars occur in a complex of ongoing diplomacy. You are always trying to convince the locals, particularly on the frontiers, to stay peaceful, to do what you want, to be on your side. And you do that in part by threatening them, but you also do that through talking to them, through bribing them. You give subsidies. There are lots of coin hoards turning up from northern Scotland. People who lived close to Hadrian's Wall lived close enough that the Roman army could go and burn their house down whenever they felt like it, and they knew that. People much further apart, through the mountain passes, a little bit more distant. So they're the ones you give money to. They're the ones that you keep bribing. They're the ones you send envoys to and gifts and prestige objects to keep them happy, because that's harder to control. So talked about warfare, that's been the theme, but that is only one part of a much bigger story of how and why this empire was so successful. So I think probably I ought to finish at that point.
Thank you very much, Professor Goldsworthy. I had two kind of related one is how transformative are the Marian army reforms? And two, nowadays, how much do we know about whether the Roman armies fought in close or open order?
Right. The Marian reforms is one of those big problems that is still ongoing, and we just don't have enough evidence to understand. I've just been writing about Augustus, and when you look at the army of his early years, we actually know very little about how it worked. All sorts of odd things crop up in the sense of identity of units. What we know definitely is that Marius took volunteers to Numidia, and that he took volunteers again when he fights against the northern barbarians. The other thing that happens that is not introduced by him, but is introduced by Rutilius Rufus around the same time, is that the methods of training employed by the gladiatorial schools of individual weapons handling were introduced to the Roman army. That does seem to suggest that in the past you've had people who have been raised and trained by their father or their uncle because they're serving because of their obligation to serve, they're serving out of duty, they're serving with their own equipment, and they are also expected to turn up on the day the army calls them as already partway to being a trained Roman soldier. If you're taking people who are not from that social group at all, then it makes sense that you start very carefully training them, not just in drill as a group, but in individual weapon skills. And this is something that will go on throughout the imperial period. The question of open and close order is difficult. It's very difficult even when you talk about hoplites, more difficult than people think, and there are different schools of thought there. No one gives us a clear definition of the frontage the legionary was supposed to occupy in Caesar's day, or Augustus' day, or anything. Vegetius in late antiquity talks about an army of, a frontage of 3 foot for a man and 6 or 7 foot depth. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, seems to be describing something looser, but actually the Greek is more than a bit ambiguous. He could be describing something 6 by 6, space for an individual fighter, or 4.5 by 6 or something. We're not quite sure. What he's doing is making a marked contrast between a Roman legionary and a Macedonian pikeman. So clearly those are denser than the Romans, but how dense is harder to say because it's a problem. My own suspicion is that Vegetius is probably something closer to the truth. You need depth between the ranks because if you're going to throw back your arm and lob a pilum, a heavy javelin at someone, you really don't want to take the eye out of the guy behind you. That also affects the depth of your formation in terms of number of ranks. Because unless you're not going to have your rear ranks throwing their weapons, bear in mind these things probably have an effective range of 15, 16 yards, 18 at the most. If you've got that depth between ranks, then you're going to start parting the hair of the man in the front rank from the ones from the rear ranks. I think probably he's right. I think Polybius, it's just a bit too confused to base things on, but it is not clear. There was enough space for a Roman legionary to fight as a swordsman, to fight effectively as an individual. There are also cases, we're told in several speeches, both talking about campaigns in Spain, but also in Germany in the early 1st century, where a Roman commander is supposed to tell his men that broken country, that woodland, that high reeds and things like that were not a disadvantage to Romans because the legionaries could fight individually in these areas. But the problem of what that meant in practical terms is one that we really can't answer. I think 3 foot's probably feasible, and like anything else, it's going to shake out a bit when you're actually on real terrain rather than on a drill square. The wider formation is certainly not impossible. Most of the enemies you're dealing with after the defeat of the Hellenistic armies are not going to be fighting in terribly well-ordered ranks. They're going to be basically shield next to shield as well as they can manage, or depending on their own culture and fighting. So that would presumably influence it. Julius Caesar does talk about legionaries fighting for Pompey against his army in Spain as fighting like the locals, not caring about ranks and files so much, rushing to a position, not caring about their order. General suggestion of a looser formation. Or it might just be that they're in the same way that you had the big debate in the British Army in the late 18th century when the experience in America had been to spread the files out, and then you've got other people who are advocating the Prussian system, which is much, much closer together. There might be all these debates, all these variations, all these local peculiarities going on in the Roman system that we just don't really know about. The only danger is, you have to say about that passage at Caesar, is although it seems to be nice, clear, and unambiguous, one thing he does very carefully in the civil wars is make the Romans he's fighting seem a bit foreign. So describing their fighting techniques as a bit different in some way justifies the fact that, hey, I'm actually killing these people who are fellow citizens. So, as always, there are problems, and the evidence just simply isn't there, I'm afraid.
I'd like to get your opinion on the whole question of analogy. Because, as you know, we've gone through different spates historically of analogy to the Roman Empire. Certainly since 911, we've had 10 to 15 years of books that have dealt with the analogy of the Roman Empire with the American Empire, if one wants to use those terms, but I think that's an accurate description. And I wanted to get your assessment of what you make of that kind of use of history, projecting it back into our concepts of what the Roman Empire was.
It's one of those interesting things. If we were having this discussion 100 years ago, then we'd be automatically comparing the Romans to the British Empire. And people like Kipling, and we're all talking about, are we going to fail? Are we going to decline and fall? Go back to the old Hollywood epics of the 50s, movies like Spartacus, Ben-Hur. Nearly always the Romans were played by British actors. And they were represented as sort of Englishmen in togas. It's changing a little bit now. Movies like the Eagle that came out recently, they thought they had the Romans were Americans. So there is this instinctive thing. To some extent, the Romans are the epitome of success and, as we said at the beginning, ultimate failure. So the superpower of the day is going to be compared to the Romans. And a lot of them consciously promote this. You've only got to look at Napoleon and the architecture, the imagery that is so Roman. You go to the camp at Boulogne, where he planned the invasion of Britain, and he built what's effectively Trajan's Column, but with pictures of sort of classicized French soldiers on, in the big field where he had that big parade to give out the first legions of honor. And there's some very weird statues of him sort of nude with a laurel wreath on and all this sort of thing that he put up in his house. And the fact that, his regiments were marching behind eagles. I think it is dangerous. It is worth our while remembering that, the Roman era was the here and now for people then. And there is always that sense that they look back. The Romans actually had a deeply pessimistic view of the world. They sort of had this general sense they weren't as good as their ancestors had been. Every now and again, someone like Augustus comes along and tries to tell them, actually things are quite good these days. We're better, we're more sophisticated, we're more successful. But they had this sort of gloomy sense they weren't really up to it and that everything in the end would probably get worse. We have, in recent centuries, we've been very happy with the idea of progress. That this is a natural thing, whether in technology, whether in prosperity. The Romans tended to have their ideal was less progress than stability. If we made things good, let's just keep it exactly like that. But in the military sense, to me, there are so many differences. There are lots of interesting parallels, and it's worth talking about them. But so many of the conditions, of the modern world, are completely different to the Roman era, but also of the type of power that America as a superpower possessed. Even if you looked at the years immediately after the Cold War, then yes, Soviet Union had collapsed. There was no rival superpower that you could see as a military equal. Even so, there were lots of states that had to count, that had to be significant, that had to be granted certain rights. As I said earlier on in the talk, the Romans didn't grant anybody else any rights whatsoever. And they didn't consider anyone an equal. You can't do that in the modern world. You can't also, in the more basic Roman way, do what Julius Caesar did, carve around Gaul and enslave 1 million people. It doesn't look good on CNN. And I did a report on Roman strategy for a strategic institution of the US Army a couple of years ago. And one of the things they were interested in was the sort of role of the proconsul of a Roman governor, of someone who could unite political and civil and military authority in one place. But the attitude was, well, very obviously, in the modern era, this could not be a soldier. In a democracy, you could not do that. So it would have to be someone civilian. But then you've got the problem of, can you actually tell someone who's gone through a civilian political career, give him some indication of how armies work and what they can and can't do? But we have these completely different structures, institutions. We also have the problem that communication is so much faster. Julius Caesar, people didn't know what was happening to him until a month or so after it had occurred. And that was even true, into the late 19th century. You have the Zulu War in 1879 that was begun by officials on the spot in British South Africa that they didn't have government permission to do it, but hoped they'd win before they found out in London, and that if you won, it would be all right. Couldn't really get away with that these days, could you? Things are much faster, but there's also the danger that people in the centre are trying to impose more control. So it's interesting, but the other thing is that be very glad we're born and alive today rather than in the Roman era, because things were a lot more comfortable, life expectancy is a lot better. One of the things, the rotting of the Roman Empire, in my view, was largely an internal thing, and it came through successive civil wars over centuries. Now, when a candidate loses a presidential election here, he doesn't go and raise an army or anything. Things are very different. So I think the differences stand out more than the similarities. But I think the analogies, they're just going to be made. They will inevitably.
Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to say, when you mentioned about empire, I just wanted to add the comment that there is also the empire of ideas, for which I think Her Majesty's empire is still quite formidable. My two brief questions are, one, could centurions, or under what process did centurions purchase commissions? And two, if we look at Shakespeare or Plutarch or something, we see, for instance, in the Battle of Philippi, where Cassius, who had his training was basically at sea, tried suggested a sort of amphibious assault. To what degree did Rome indulge in that?
Right. First of all, centurions. There's no evidence at all for formally purchasing a commission in the organized way that, say, existed in the British Army in 18th and into the 19th century. However, patronage very clearly played a role, and what we do read about, there's a letter from Pliny writing to a provincial governor who's got an army under his command, saying, well, you've been there more than a year. You must have given rewards out to all your friends. Have you got any centurions or tribunes commissions for some of mine now? So patronage plays a very open part. The Romans would not have seen that as corruption. Today patronage clearly exists in almost any institution, and you will have people who will have their protégés, who will, whether it's they consider they are spotting talent and want to bring these people on. The Romans do it quite openly, and they do it with letters that will be sent to people. And again, there is no sense, in a funny sort of way, the system worked because it relied upon, for your patronage to be worthwhile, for people to accept your recommendations, you couldn't go around consistently recommending idiots. Because in the end, people would realize it wasn't worth listening to you. So you might slip a few in, and I'm sure you did. But on the whole, your patronage counts for more if you send good people. So in a funny sort of way, it works. The other thing is, to move on to the other point, we have to be careful. There is a tendency, because we think of this as natural, to talk about the Roman navy. But the Romans didn't really think that way. They would have talked about the military, which included naval elements. The same men are in command. Recruitment, for instance, of the imperial navy is rather different. Former slaves can join the navy, which they can't join the army. But the structures of it are the same. The people who command naval flotillas are people who've had land-based commands as well. It was a regular thing to use naval support. In part, you're doing it if you've got a nice big navigable river or along a coastline, because moving large quantities of supplies is obviously a lot easier by sea than by land. There is sometimes a tendency to think of it as land warfare just by other means. Julius Caesar, in particular, is decidedly unsubtle when he comes to approaching the sea. He manages twice to make the same mistake in Britain of doing the nice Mediterranean thing. At the end of the day, you drag your ships up on the shore, leave them on the beach, and think everything will be wonderful, because it's the Mediterranean. It doesn't have tides, and it doesn't have big storms. And the English Channel isn't like that. And you would have thought, after he'd had most of his first fleet wrecked, that the next year he wouldn't have done the same thing, but he does. But again, he's got enough craftsmen in the legions to repair them. So you have the emphasis on Tacitus' account of his father-in-law Agricola's campaigns in northern Britain is the support the navy offered coming along the coast. The other thing is that we tend to think of the big sort of seagoing navy, but patrol boats on rivers are a very common feature and frequently supported the army. They're also useful for stopping raiding, because that might occur by sea. It'll go on later on. You're getting people who are doing pretty much the same sort of thing the Vikings were, just in slightly smaller boats. And you try to deal with them. Vegetius, in the turn of the 4th, early 5th century, rather nicely tells us that the fleet that was supposed to be patrolling the English Channel had the hulls of its ships, or probably small patrol vessels, and the sails and the clothes of the sailors were coloured sea blue-grey. So it's probably the first attempt to blend in, which is quite interesting. The problem is we just have that one quote. We don't have any other evidence of this actually going on. And by that time, the empire's rotting so badly, there probably isn't much there. So it is definitely, it's an integrated part of the whole thing. It doesn't really have the same prestige, only at certain periods. You get the big naval battles in the civil wars of the end of the 1st century BC. After that, there's really nobody out there that makes it worthwhile raising a fleet to fight against. So it tends to be much more a supporting role and a patrolling role, a small scale. But it is there and it is very big. So it is part of the whole always. And as a politician, as you get given command, you're expected to pick this up. And if you don't know how to do it, then you go and ask someone who does. That's the other Roman way.
There may be many reasons for the collapse of the Roman Empire. What is your view for the main reason for the collapse?
For me, the main reason is political instability. It's a bit of a crude statistic, but it is significant. From the year 218 AD onwards, up until the collapse of the Western Empire and the deposition of the last emperor to rule in the West, Romulus Augustulus, and he didn't rule much of the West, there are only 3 decades in that period of more than 2.5 centuries where there is not a civil war. And to me, the Roman Empire rots away. It doesn't face a rival outside that can push it over. And none of these civil wars are fought about any ideological issue whatsoever. They are purely about power. But the later army, the army of the 4th century into the 5th century, has the potential to be just as good as the army earlier on, in terms of they know about training, they know about discipline, they know about equipment. All of these things exist. But it faces lots of problems. The infrastructure to support it has gone. All those big bases, those fortresses, those camps that are so obvious up to the early 3rd century have vanished. They don't exist anymore. With them have gone the drill squares, the training areas, the barrack blocks, the hospitals, and the stable blocks. By the 4th century, the army's being billeted on towns and cities for the winter. But if you went to how many cities, how often could you go somewhere and say, right, I want you to stable 2,000 horses for me and keep them in good condition? This is a cruder way of doing it. It's a backward step. The other thing is, one of the best historians of the late Roman army is a chap called Hugh Elton, who wrote a book called Warfare in Roman Europe that is very good, very well worth a read. He points out quite rightly that in this late period, the later Roman army wins most of the battles it fights, nearly all, 90%. The point he doesn't make, and rather ignores, is that 2/3, 3/4 of those battles were fought against other Roman armies. So actually it's also losing nearly all the battles it fights as well. You can't ignore this. This is not something that just goes away. The problem is most of the historians who specialize in the era look at institutions, they look at culture, they look at religion, they look at ideas. None of these change as a result of civil wars. As I say, there's no ideology involved in them at all. But the rotting away, the fact that you can't trust your commanders, your subordinates, that the best way to prove your loyalty is to rat on someone else and condemn them and say, they've been plotting against you, aren't I a good little boy, now have them and their family executed. A telling example is when the Goths arrive on the Danube in 376 AD. So similar situation to the one Julius Caesar faced in 58 BC when the Helvetii arrive. Julius Caesar, a provincial governor, the man on the spot, takes charge, beats them in battle, slaughters them, sends them home. Okay, that's Julius Caesar, and he interpreted his remit very aggressively, but nevertheless, it's dealt with by the man on the spot. In 376, it cannot be. What happens is that even though you have the resources of the combined East and Western empires to deal with 20,000 or so at most warriors that have turned up and their families, and probably fewer than that, you fight them for 6 years. You fight 4 battles and lose 3 of them. In one of them, you get an emperor killed. You've got the potential to be good. You've got the resources, but you cannot marshal them. You cannot organize them. But the difference is that the enemy you're fighting can't really hurt you in the long run. The Goths end up getting a good settlement. They get settled on Roman land. Later on, a generation on, they'll sack Rome, and they sort of meander around a bit. But the empire doesn't fall. They don't have the military capacity to knock the empire over, and they don't want to do that. So it's a slow rotting that affects institutions like the army until they become less and less efficient. and then it tends to collapse in stages. There is a disaster and a couple of provinces go. Then it continues and everyone pretends everything's all right. And then another one goes, and another one goes, and eventually there's nothing left. The East, by this stage, is a little bit more manageable and survives in a larger size for a long time. And it also is more stable. It has fewer civil wars, but that's a bit of a complicated issue.
Thank you for your talk, sir. My own area of research is the late Roman army, and I have a question for you. There is, of course, a transition from the use of the gladius to the spatha, but I have not found evidence to indicate the methods of use changed. Do you have any information on that?
Essentially, no, because all we have is the assumption that it's a different shape, though sometimes what we define as a gladius and what we define as a spatha is actually less different than you might think when you see the examples. You know, they're broad terms that cover quite a range, but nobody talks about it. I mean, Ammianus seems to imply that the Romans are thrusting just as much as they ever have. The spatha is perfectly good for that. To me, slightly more significant is the fact that the pilum seems to fall out of service, and you go with lighter javelins or spears, things that keep the enemy a bit further away. I think there is a decline in that aggression, which was get very close, slam the boss of your shield into a man's face to unbalance him and stab him in the gut, sort of thing. You know, it is very aggressive as an individual thing, as well as the higher level of the army. Whereas I think you've stepped back from that, but not to the extent that you couldn't do that. I think a well-trained unit, well-motivated unit, could fight just as effectively in that way. I suspect some of it is actually ease of production. What you do have in that period is also this move towards more state-centralized production, rather than the fabricae of the legionary fortresses making a lot of what you've got. You know, think of the Notitia, where you have arms factories listed. And the general design of Roman military equipment, whilst you still get the ornate examples, it gets a bit simpler. You know, you get helmets that are made from sections rather than as a bowl of one piece. Now, they pretty much do the job just as well as anything else, but they don't look quite so good. It's not quite so fancy. But they can also serve to equip a cavalryman or an infantryman equally. What you really want is swords, equipment. And I think, again, remember the confusion and the chaos of the Civil War periods. Simple production is really what you want. So I think it's, you know, they're the sort of, it becomes, I don't know, they're the AK-47 or the T-34 of the ancient world or something. They do the job very well. They're just a bit cruder, but they're still a good, simple design. So I think maybe there's actually more of that than a fundamental tactical change. But the problem is, you know, as you'll know, the evidence for what's going on in the 3rd century is so abysmal. And really the evidence for the 2nd century army fighting is so poor that these changes are going on and something is happening, but we really don't know why.
Professor, for centuries, the Romans seem to have had an Iranian problem with the Parthians. Crassus got disastrously defeated by the Parthians, and I think that before he was assassinated, Julius was supposed to go had a campaign planned against him to get revenge. Whether he would have did well or not, I don't know. Why did and also during the Empire, they were constantly fighting with the Parthians and those who succeeded the Parthians. Why? What are the elements that you think gave the Romans so much trouble with them?
It's obviously a different tactical system that you're facing, in that this is largely, though far from exclusively, a cavalry-based army, that you have the idea of the horse archer who doesn't want to get up close and doesn't want to fight with you and is quite happy to ride away. You know, Crassus's son gets killed at Carrhae because he's gone with a load of brave Gallic cavalry and chased off after some horse archers, disappears from the main column, gets surrounded, gets wiped out. However, there are other factors going on as well, in that the contact occurs quite late in the phase of Roman aggression. And the first contact consists of both the Parthians and the Romans used to beating anyone they face very easily. They are each the dominant power. The Romans have gone through the Armenians and Mithridates of Pontus and all these armies very, very easily. The Parthians have been doing the same thing against similar opposition. They're both confident, they're both very good, they're both rather different in the way they fight. The Battle of Carrhae, the defeat of Crassus, is really more of a standoff than a tactical victory for the Parthians. Because they look at these Romans and they think, well, hang on a minute, we can't just ride them down. And they bombard them with arrows for a long time, and they inflict lots of wounds, but they don't break the Roman square. Crassus's problem is that strategically, he's in an absolute mess because he's right out in the middle of nowhere. He's lost most of his cavalry. He can't go anywhere. He's got heavy casualties with all these wounded. He retreats. And the one thing you really don't want to do in front of an army of horse archers and cavalry is retreat in open country. Mark Antony ends up making a similar pig's breakfast of things when he tries to avenge Crassus in 37-36. However, there's a big myth about Mark Antony that he promoted himself, that he was a good and experienced soldier. He wasn't. He spent virtually no time with the Roman army at all. And he tries to behave with an army of about 40,000 men in the same way that he led a cavalry unit of about 500-600. And it doesn't work, unsurprisingly. He's very careless about logistics. He's very careless about planning. So two fairly shaky Roman armies and overconfident Roman armies do badly. On the other hand, when the Parthians invade Syria, they get hammered in two battles by one of Antony's legates, Ventidius Bassus. This is when the Parthians think, well, these Romans are easy to beat, so they charge down on them, they'll fight them whatever the position they're in, and they get defeated. The big change, the Romans will go, and in later years, every generation or so, there's a war with Parthia, which the Romans nearly always start. And in the 2nd century AD, several times under Trajan, under Marcus Aurelius, they head down the Tigris-Euphrates valleys, go to Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, burn it down, sack it. The Romans can do that in a way the Parthians can never do it in the other direction. The big difference for me, and the reason why, in a sense, it remains a permanent standoff, is that not so much that the Romans couldn't have adapted to deal with that military problem, but that there is not the political will to do it. After Augustus's death in AD 14, there is very little expansion. Invading Parthia was going to be a major expedition. It was going to require a lot of soldiers and a lot of time and a lot of logistics, and it was going to be risky. It would be difficult. No emperor, really, other than Trajan, other than a few others, wants to risk spending that time and effort and resources off on the fringes. They don't need to do it. The Parthians aren't a threat. Not really. You can keep enough troops to keep them occupied and busy. The same is also largely true with the Sassanid Persians that succeed them. They are built up in modern sources as this great, very, very efficient, far more effective fighting force than the Parthians, ignoring the fact that the Sassanid Persians were simply one section of the Parthian Empire anyway. These are the same people, just a different political group, different group in charge. Their successes tend to coincide with periods of Roman weakness after a long spell of civil war. And their successes also tend to coincide with eras when a Persian king has had to fight his way to power and has an extremely good army. So you get times when one is weak and the other is strong, and therefore you get an expedition which does well. This happens in both directions. But in the end, most are content with the standoff. So political reasons on both sides. It is too big a risk to precipitate a major war and keep fighting the other. So it tends to end up, they become much more border struggles about controlling fortresses, controlling the places where there's water, and occasional deep raids into the other's territory to take slaves, to take plunder for prestige. But I don't think the Roman Empire stopped there because the Romans could not have developed a way of fighting against the Parthians. But I think there are lots of political imperatives that prevent them from trying this. So that would be my take, but it becomes a hypothetical because we don't know what might have happened.
Professor, is there truth in your assertion that Paulus's relatives tried to make Varro the scapegoat for the defeat at Cannae, or is that an exaggeration?
They certainly, after all, the historian Polybius is living in the household of Scipio Aemilianus, who is a son of the man who was killed at Cannae. Aemilius Paulus gets a very good write-up. However, it becomes much stronger in Livy's account, which is written a lot later than in Polybius, and Varro is painted as much more of a buffoon. The arguments that sometimes it gets into a complicated conspiracy theory, but in the end, I think it is more the benefit of hindsight. Politically, the Aemilii Pauli they were a far more important family. You know, Varro doesn't really have his descendants pop up every now and again, but they never become one of the central families of the Republic. So yes, they don't get as good a write-up. On the other hand, he was less experienced. Paulus had fought as a consul before. He had won a victory, but he'd won a victory in a campaign in Illyricum, the sort of coast of former Yugoslavia, fighting mainly against raiders, against pirates, small-scale stuff, completely different experience. Nobody had any experience of controlling a Roman army of 8 legions. You know, they'd not done this before. And those 8 legions are largely inexperienced troops as well. You're fighting a few months after they've been formed. So you're doing something new with troops that are new. So the clumsiness of it, I think, even Fabius Maximus, famous as the Cunctator, the delayer, only delayed until the Romans had recovered their strength from earlier defeats to be able to face Hannibal and to weaken him. It is not a passive thing. It is very much nibble away at him, build up, but don't take any risk until we're stronger. I think, to be honest, Varro was doing a perfectly natural thing for a Roman to do. And quite frankly, against almost anybody else but Hannibal, and almost any other army but that one he controlled, which was so experienced and so flexible, then I think that Roman force would have steamrolled through it. This is a really big army. So it's probably less stupid than it seems. And we don't know precisely where the battlefield occurred, but my guess, following people like Peter Connolly, is that it occurred, the river was in a different place to where it is now, that it occurred between the river and the hill in a narrow area that should have protected them from Hannibal's superior cavalry. The plan is actually quite sensible with the resources they have. And they couldn't have kept an army like that in the field for very long. You can't feed 8 legions. You can't feed 86,000 men for very long and all their horses and keep them in good condition, especially as Hannibal's plundering all the area around. So I don't think they would have formed that army and put together unless they planned to fight a battle. So Paulus and Varro may have argued about where and when and on whose day to fight it. But I think in general, actually, the strategy was probably shared by both of them. And Polybius is much less critical than Livy. So I think even Polybius, who is closest to the family, sort of shows it as fairly, almost justified.
Centurions came in directly. So if they didn't have any training, how do they handle complicated maneuvers like getting one line, let's fighting, to go back and have that second line move up? So I'm trying to combine the 2 questions. I originally had 2 questions, but
right. It's 2 questions.
One. So how did they handle that without any formal training?
One thing that is worth stating, because it's one of the sort of the repeated myths of the Roman army. There is actually no real evidence for taking a line that's in the fighting line and fighting, pulling it back and replacing it with another. This is something that Livy talks about in one theoretical passage about the very early Roman army, and it's grown on to become this is what the Romans did. What they do talk about is sending the second line in to reinforce the fighting line. So it's a wave effect where you're trying to get momentum going, get people, fresh troops in, try and get you moving forward again, try and get some more aggression. So it's a slightly different thing, and the idea you saw there was that when they did that HBO Rome series, they had a centurion blowing whistles and the individual ranks replacing themselves. Not the slightest shred of evidence for any of that. But it gets repeated again and again. On the other hand, you're perfectly right, they are having to learn quite complicated drills, but I think, again, this is the situation that you would have encountered with any officer in an 18th, early 19th century army. There would have been some reading matter available, but then they would go to their unit and they would be trained by their unit and they would drill with everybody else. So, but that's a guess and an assumption. There is no direct evidence for that.
There is a conservative American military historian whose name I've forgotten, but his take on the success of Western armies, particularly Rome's, was that Western soldiers, by attitude, were simply more ferocious than any of their enemies. Do you buy into that too?
That's probably Victor Davis Hanson, I suspect. There is an element, but on the other hand, there's an awful lot of very ferocious people out there in the ancient world. They might be organized in a different way. I mean, the Romans are unusual because the Romans talk about the Western barbarians as not being disciplined enough, that they lack stamina. They'll be very brave in the first charge, but if you face up to them, they'll run away. There is something that is sort of savage, really, about Roman warfare. Polybius, the Greek historian, said that the Romans relied on force, on brute force, above everything else in military affairs. And there is a fair bit of truth in that. It becomes fairly subtly used and well-directed force. They certainly are fond of decisive battles, but on the other hand, in a way, so are the Persians, although perhaps they're fonder of sieges. That's a big sort of processional thing. There is something, the difference between a Greek hoplite willing to stand in that phalanx and charge forward and fight someone is not, and say a Celtic warrior who's actually doing the same thing with less armor, is less different. The problem is, which is something that I think Hansen has actually, a point he's made quite well, is that we sometimes extend the image of the Greeks and make them all these philosophers instead of a bunch of farmers and aristocrats and competing people politically. They're civilized to some extent, but they're not trained other than as individuals. There is something very different about the Romans, and the Romans are certainly savage and they are certainly ferocious, and it is something that will last all the way through. On the other hand, I'm not sure it is so quintessentially Western. Obviously, I mean, Chinese armies are doing this at the same time, but there's obviously no meaningful contact. And all of these things, there are certainly major cultural factors affecting the way different armies fight. But I think broad brush of Western aggressive decisive battle and Easterners less so is a bit too simplistic. There is some truth in it, and it certainly becomes more pronounced because the Western tradition gets established in the view of it presented in the classical sources. But when you think, you go to medieval warfare, battles are very, very rare there because nobody wants to take the risk. Sieges are what's happened and raids are what happened all the time. So Westerners haven't always done things the same way. The other difference with the Romans is that they don't have to fight a battle. They are quite happy to win a war that involves the enemy surrendering to them. And one of the things that commanders and emperors celebrate are the occasions where they paraded their force, where, for instance, they went to the Euphrates, sat on a tribunal, and a Parthian or a Persian came to talk to them, and there were the serried ranks of the Roman legion behind them and all the standards ranked up, and you could see how strong they were, and therefore you wouldn't fight them. So it's certainly not ferocity for its own sake, but it's rather like successful politicians like Julius Caesar. They're not savage and cruel just for the sake of it. If they do it, it's for a reason. And the Roman attitude towards atrocity fits into that category. They will go and crucify thousands of people. They will slaughter an entire community. They will burn it down. But they won't do it just for the sake of it. They'll do it because they think, well, this means that then I won't have to fight in the next city and the next city, and they'll all come over to me. They'll do it if they think it'll get them somewhere. So I think it is a controlled ferocity, and maybe it's actually in that discipline, that level of control, that is something that marks out a more sophisticated army that gives the advantage. But with any of these broad brush claims, it's so difficult to... There will always be exceptions, and I don't think any of them really work that well.